Alright, guys, I'm back with Chapter 2 of Infertile Ground. Okay, so where have I left off? Okay, the roots of carrying capacity. At the same time that the field of demography was being established, biological and ecological scientists were at hard work on their own search for quantitative explanations of the world. The history of carrying capacity and its application to the population problem is one of a search for numbers, a number calculation or equation that can quantify the correct number of people to limit population to in order to establish or to achieve balance with natural resources and prevent or reduce environmental degradation. Such a number was never has never been found. However, the quest to find it has never waned. The reasons for this are complex. The language of mathematics, which is highly structured and rule-bound, projects a sense of uniformity and rigor. This language is easily transportable across vast distances of demography and culture, minimizing the need for an intimate knowledge of locality and community. Um, Moreover, the discourse of mathematics helps to produce knowledge independent, quote, produce knowledge independent of a particular people who make it, end quote. Quantification and its close identification with scientific objectivity is often taken to signify a, quote, set of strategies for dealing with distance and distrust, a universalizing technology for representing truths in ways that minimize complexity and erase the position of the person producing the knowledge. Demography lent strong tools to this quest through projections, models, and statistical methods. As the previous section demonstrated, both demography and eugenics also produced ideas of the centrality of racial difference relative to population size, growth, and reproductive behavior across racial, cultural, demographic issues, or demographic lines. Environmentalists would carry this notion further, embedded it in arguments around earthly limits and the need for a race and class lens for population interventions. Unlike interventions developed to address public health, carrying capacity arguments would be used as a basis for arguing against the optimization of human health, and for a cold calculus in determining the relative value of lives, particularly those deemed environmentally destructive. Um, Environmentally destructive as in it just looks ugly, so it must be the issue. So we create people in poverty and then say that they're the issue, whether or not we at first believed it or not. It actually is pretty fucked up that there's this propaganda, even though it's like it's unsound logic, despite China having a greater population than the West, but their emissions are down. Okay, population biology and the population ecology have uh, have relied heavily on the logistical growth curve and model developed by American zoologist Raymond Pearl, working with statistician Lowell Reed and heavily influenced by the ideas of mathematician Pierre Verhulst. Pearl was the recent figure responsible for circulating the idea of the logical growth curve as a natural law of population growth. Pearl was an editor of the Journal of Heredity, where he oversaw the publication of articles arguing that the communities with the highest birth rates were least wealthy and educated, and that, quote, the old stock has been overrun. Um, so this is unfair to say that this is inherent, although there is truth to overall how society has been expected to structure itself. Uh, Education over births. Um, this doesn't necessarily mean you're uneducated just because you have 5 kids. But of course, not many people want to have 5 kids or can afford to have kids. So it only means that you would just be trying to educate yourself or get by in some type of way. But to a eugenicist, not having kids and educating yourself or doing anything besides having the right demographic would be considered like an uneducated or dysgenic move to them. Okay, he studied yeast and fruit flies, bread in glass jars, extrapolating from these results to argue that human population growth follows a strikingly similar pattern to that of other organisms in nature, one that fits into a smooth S pattern known as the logistical curve. In this model, population growth exponentially until reaching a limit defined by the environment, at which time it began to decelerate and decline. Pearl argued that this process is biological, asserting that, quote, all the complexities of human behavior, social organization, economic structure, and political activity seem to alter much less than would have been expected the results of the operation of these biological factors, which basically determine the course of the growth of the population of men, as well as those of yeast cells and flies. In other words, he assigned biology explanatory power as the determining force in population growth and ultimately its limits. Pearl was the first to take population from an abstract uh, object of concern to a scientific object to be studied and manipulated through the direct intervention. Unlike Malthus, who viewed food production and population growth as fixed rates such that population would inevitably overwhelm the food production, Pearl saw these rates as adjustable based on interventions through state policies and technologies. He was concerned about global resource limits and was an early critic of human patterns of resource consumption, arguing that, quote, the volume and the surface of the planet at which we live are strictly fixed quantities. Um, the fact sets a limit. So he's not really saying anything. It's just still a kind of a guess that he's making without really stating at what number. And this is kind of how this argument is sort of being formulated since I began reading this chapter, or this part of the chapter. Anyways, however, the logistical growth curve was widely rejected by the economists and demographic statisticians at the time that Pearl promoted. That Pearl promoted it. The model did not fit much of the existing data on the population trends in many countries around the world and was thus ineffective in predicting future population trends. Yet, over the next 2 decades, it became incorporated into measures and formulas tracking population growth in both population biology and population ecology, fields that heavily influenced the development of population demography. Why did this happen? One explanation is provided through Pearl's personal effects, including mounting a massive public relations campaign among his natural scientist peers, publishing numerous papers, articles, and books attesting to the validity of the logistical curve model. In one, he laid out three principles outlining what he saw as the biological basis for the behavior of all organisms: the drive for personal survival, the urge to reproduce, and genetic somatic variability. To them, he added a fourth determining factor: the environment. Quote, in considering the biology of populations, one aspect of the environment is of particular importance, both theoretical and practical, end quote, he argued, and goes on to say, this is available space. The number of organisms in the population taken in relation to the available space determines destiny, a major factor of significance in population biology, end quote. Pearl's goal was to produce a model that could make standard predictions about future population growth at regional and global levels. What initially emerged as an intuitive, a priori perspective and was initially discredited has become grounded as central to understanding the biological basis of population growth and decline. It was also incorporated decades later into theories of carrying capacity when they were applied to human population growth. While Pearl was working to promote his theory of logistical curve, efforts were underway to organize the first international union of population scientists, the International Union for Scientific Investigation of Population, whose primary concerns were soil productivity and political borders. Early conveners, uh, governors, I'm still like on this stuff, honestly. I'm gonna go with Coveners because I really do think there's an I in there. If you're still watching this, guys, I am so sorry. This is beyond, like, uh, anyways, I really should know that. Okay, early governors were also concerned with optimal population density, carrying capacity, and migration laws. These were simultaneously scientific questions as well as geopolitical concerns and questions of earthly and spatial phenomena centered on population size and distribution and relation to land. Malthusians, economists, and geographers, and early demographers involved in the Union all shared the belief that the question of population density and the differences of those densities between nations and regions of the world was central to international relations. A key question of international relations then had to be that of how to resolve the problem of uneven population distribution. Okay. Many of these scientists looked to the then recent history of the World War I to argue that growth and uneven distribution of population was a likely cause of war. As a result, they posited a better distribution of global populations based on optimum density as a necessary solution. So the sad thing is that there's already elites by the time World War I happened, and wealth was accumulating probably back then, and so obviously war was in the shadow of who was holding the wealth, while nations fought for reasons they thought they were justified for. At least that's my guess. Bashford's analysis of thousands of publications on world population from 1920 and 1930s reveals that the most common statement found in these documents was that, quote, overpopulation understood in terms of comparative density caused war, end quote. Land wasn't the only concern, at least not in itself. The scientists were primarily focused on food production. Their concerns about fertility were just as much about soil fertility as they were about women's reproductive fertility. Many early conservationists and population scientists at the time were first concerned about solving problems of land and food distribution. Managing women's fertility was simply the most expedient means to the end. So, for the most part, this makes sense, unfortunately, whether it's coercive or not, to have children, to have people maintain the land through generations, especially if you're building a society and having this be like a luxurious place for people to, you know, it's convenient for them, and like a supermarket, a proto supermarket in a sense. Um, so the balance of the population does make sense, but there isn't an inherent number at all that would destroy a society. The society functions and assumes that it needs and wants a specific population size, and so it will do whatever it will do can do to reduce or grow the population. And so it just makes sense for farming overall and production before machines. Anyways, carrying capacity has become one of the single most scientific concepts in neo-Malthusian arguments about population growth and environmental limits. It is centrally concerned with the equations of limits, the idea of people around the globe sharing the limited living space characterized by strain and crowdedness. Ironically, the phrase itself did not originate with Malthus, nor with studies of population. Rather, the term carrying capacity was coined in 1845 as a reference to the tonnage of storage capacity of ships, and was mainly invoked in discussions international trade disputes. It was later applied to animals and rearranged. Oh, sorry. Uh, rangeland management. Although Leopold was a prominent and vocal supporter of this model, in the 1930s Leopold took up the concept in the analysis of population crash among the deer, creating a theory of carrying capacity that would allow game managers to increase or decrease population of game by manipulating factors like environmental habitats, controlling populations of predators, and relocating animals or releasing the captive bred into the wild. He defined carrying capacity as the number of livestock a given area of land could support without the land degrading. There was significant debate over the concept, many range scientists at the time rejecting carrying capacity outright. However, some scientists forged ahead in using the term, and by the 1940s they applied it to the people. In the 1941, in a 1941 speech entitled Ecology in Politics, Leopold argued that every environment carries not only characteristic kinds of animals, but characteristic numbers of each. That number is the carrying capacity of that land for that species, end quote, and extrapolated these ideas from animals to humans. Quote, perhaps the present world revolution is the sign that we have exceeded that limit, or that we have approached it too rapidly. Carrying capacity later emerged as an expression of state power and control through selective application by state authorities. Because of its development and circulation through scientific discourse, carrying capacity became so embedded in population scientists that, quote, even when carrying capacity proved illusory, they provided an appearance of objectivity, rationality, and precision to policies that might otherwise have been revealed as politically or economically motivated. Following World War II, concerns about population, resources, and international conflict exploded among American researchers and policymakers, refracted through the lens of environmentalism. In 1948, William Vaux published Road to Survival, the first tract articulating a global Malthusian carrying capacity. Quote, the lot of each is completely dependent on his or her global environment, and each of them in greater or less degree influences that environment. One common denominator controls their lives. The ratio between human population and supply of natural resources with which they live, such as soil, water, plants, and animals, end quote. He concluded that carrying capacity was a result of the ratio between biotic and environmental factors, an equation that, quote, every minute of every day touched the life of every man, woman, and child on the face of the globe. So, locally, I think, and this will sound contradictory, of course, locally, yes, I think the population matters in terms of where you are unorganically putting the resources, but organically the resources are abundant, and organically we could give food to everyone, but of course we do artificial scarcity. So we don't give food around the globe. We do a subaltern version of trying to help, even though we're still technically hoarding the vast majority of it. So for normies and their struggle, population matters. But it doesn't actually matter in terms of like who's orchestrating how resource distribution is and who wants to engineer up or down the population. Anyways, while drawing scientific conclusions, Vaux interpreted and communicated them in political terms, the apocalyptic language of war, chaos, and death. He argued that if state leaders ignore the relationships described in his equation, death and destruction was inevitable. Quote, there is little probability that mankind can long escape an searing downpour of war's death from the skies, end quote, leading to the state of global chaos in which he goes on to say at least 3/4 of the human race will be wiped out, end quote. His book was written as a polemic, one directed at the poor. In it, he railed against doctors for keeping poor colonial populations alive and able to multiply. He excoriated the poor for reducing and degrading land and soil quality, pushing it to the limits of its productivity, and he advocated harsh policing of the threat posed by growth populations in Asia. Among the solutions he advocated, controlling living human population growth through contraception was primary. Vaux recommended that the Food and Agricultural Organization integrate population control into its observation and food production programs, including denying food aid to India and China, since with such aid, one would, quote, keep alive 10 million Indians and Chinese this year so that 15 million may die 5 years hence, end quote. Although he argued that contraceptive use should be voluntary, Vo supported providing financial bonuses to individuals who agreed to be permanently sterilized. Road to Survival was a runaway success, and 3 years later, Vo was appointed National Director of Planned Parenthood Association of America, a position which he occupied for the next 30 years on an agenda favoring the distribution of cheap contraceptives, strategies to increase contraceptive demand, and linking food aid to population control. In 1953, Fairfield Osborn authored, quote, The Limits of the Earth, where he argued that the world is, quote, under the control of the eternal equation, the relationship between our resources and the number as well as the needs of the people, end quote. This relationship could be expressed in a simple ratio dividing the Earth's resources by the number of people on it, and scarcities were provoked by the finite nature of the planet. Beyond their arguments about natural limits, both Osborn and Vo claim that the resources scarcities and environmental degradation were direct causes of war and had spurred World War I and II. They were concerned about overconsumption and resources and the exporting of American consumerism values in the post-war period, arguing that American standards of living, if spread around the world, would have disastrous effects. Their arguments about consumption and population were inseparable. Both were problems that needed to be managed and reduced in order to ensure that not only ecological but also geopolitical stability. These ideas would be taken up on a national scale a little over a decade later, facilitated by widespread attention to rapidly growing movement, the mainstream American environmental movement. Voluntarism, coercion, and carrying capacity as public policy. Beginning in the 1960s, prominent environmentalists turned to the focus on overpopulation-induced poverty and war combined with new ecological models, end quote, to bring about new ways of thinking, talking about, and advocating for environmental issues in the U.S. The independence of formerly colonized nations in the global South and Cold War struggle over third world resources led many Americans to worry about population growth in the global South as a potential threat to U.S. national security. For others, it was a planetary problem that could bridge regional divides. American scientists Garrett Hardin and Paul Ulrich were two of the most prominent voices that linked carrying capacity ideas to human population control, arguing that earthly limits and ecological crisis they produced made it necessary to foreground population control over development, public health, and voluntary management of one's own fertility. They also publicly returned the population conversation to race and class by including white Americans and the middle class in their notions of shared population responsibility, even as they indirectly invoked the role of race and culture in producing sustainable population growth in the global South. While many of their writings supported coercive population control policies, to a limited extent they also promoted advocacy for women-centered reproductive health interventions. In doing so, Hardin and Ulrich laid the groundwork for current manifestations of sexual stewardship. Sexual stewardship would be like taking the team for the rest of culture and human species and having a child for the species or not having a child for the species. This is what they mean by sexual stewardship, unfortunately. I feel like there might be other terms related to stewardship specifically. Anyways, in 1968, ecologist Garrett Hardin wrote a well-known article, quote, The Tragedy of the Commons. I've talked about this a lot, but not in a population control way. In terms of overfishing in specific areas where might be not totally natural anymore because of our boats and stuff sort of driving away the fish, like as opposed to waters that weren't being used. This is my guess about the localized aspect of the population issue. Anyways, in which he described his ideas about the dangers of a population by using the metaphor of common pasture available to all to graze their herds. His arguments was that each person using the commons would graze as many cattle as possible, uh, acting out of self-interest and seeking to achieve maximum possible gains from the land. This, he argued, would ultimately lead to destruction of the land and peril for humans. Quote, ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in the commons brings ruin to all. End quote. The commons, he described, symbolized the earth and natural resources. The metaphor of grazing cattle represented population growth. Hardin's aim was to supply the concept of carrying capacity literally, and he concluded that there is no technical solution available. Instead, the population problem was one that required moral solutions. Quote, from this conclusion sprang, quote, directly from biological facts, end quote. He was concerned that identifying the optimum population size, the central problem question of carrying capacity. The article was a, quote, philosophical defense of coercion so influential, especially in environmental circles, that it was called, quote, the Magna Carta of compulsory population control. The tragedy of the commons, as he conceived it, is actually the tragedy of the welfare state. Hardin argued that if families only depended on their own resources and the children of improvident parents starved to death, there would be, quote, no public interest in controlling the breeding of families, end quote. His solution to the problem? A sense of moral responsibility through, quote, mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon by the majority of affected people, but particularly focused on women. Hardin was concerned that technical solutions to the population problems would not work because they did not impact people's values. The freedom to reproduce or breed, as he termed it, would bring ruin to all. As such, coercive population control is a necessary strategy to save everyone. Okay, so welfare, stuff like that, again, used to be for the demographic they wanted to live until more and more people gained access to it in their version of politically correct, and so they had to talk about this in a way that was just in a generalized sense of damn the poor, they should work harder or whatever. I assume at this time workfare wasn't a thing, so anyways. Moreover, Hardin's ideas actually arose from virulent anti-immigrant sentiment. These politics came to the forefront in the 1974 essay, quote, Living on the Lifeboat, in which he argued that the problems of the tragedy of the commons were no longer simply urgent. They were now a matter of human survival. Likening the regions of the world to lifeboats on a hostile and dangerous sea, Hardin described the rich populations of the global north living in lifeboats surrounded by dangerous waters. The poor, living in their own, far from crowded boats, were constantly falling overboard and hoping to be taken in and saved by the people on the rich boats, which were limited in capacity. Limited in capacity as in they have spots for the demographic they want, but not for those of their limited demographic being filled by another. Okay. Hardin argued that admitting impoverished others to the wealthy boats, knowing the boats limited would capsize the boat and kill everyone on board, an unethical and unacceptable solution. As a remedy, he proposed ethics of the lifeboat, quote, to admit no more to the boat and preserve the small safety factor. Survival of the people in the lifeboat is then possible, though we shall have to be on our guard against boarding parties, end quote. This neo-Darwinian argument formed the basis of several population control policies Hardin proposed, which included cutting food aid to less developed countries and severely restricting immigration to the U.S. He also, we're still restricting immigration to the U.S. We do this all the time. Anyways, He also brought women under the banner of the population control agenda in the contradictory ways, alternately arguing a need to control women's childbearing and for an expansion of their access to reproductive services. Hardin wrote, quote, "The women's liberation movement may not like it, but control must be exerted through females," end quote, because divorce and remarriage constrain the responsibility of couples and men. At the same time, Hardin was first to invoke the term abortion on demand, a phrase that would later become a rallying cry for reproductive rights groups. Hardin's contemporary biologist Paul Ulrich argued similarly that starving populations in the growing global south were beyond the scope of concern of wealthier nations, doomed as they were to an inevitable destiny of starvation based on rampant population growth. His well-known text, The Population Bomb, opens thus: "The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famines. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. Although many lives could be saved through dramatic programs to stretch the carrying capacity to the earth by increasing food production. But these programs will only provide a stay of execution unless they are accompanied by determined and successful efforts at population control. Population control is the conscious regulation of the number of human beings to meet the needs, not just of individual families, but of society as a whole." Alright, I don't know how long this is, but I will be back in the next one, guys.